Welcome to New Thinking for a New World, a Telberg Foundation podcast. I am Alan Stoga, your host. Each week, I bring you conversations with people who think differently about the great issues that are shaping our world. Geopolitics, disruptive tech, mass migration, the changing climate, culture wars, all of it is grist for our mill. I hope you enjoy listening. I also hope you will let me know what you think and that you join the conversation at telbergfoundation.org. And now for today's episode of New Thinking for a New World. The start of 2025 is burdened with no shortage of things to worry about. The war in Ukraine, continuing conflicts throughout the Middle East, all the uncertainties around what Donald Trump will actually do when he's president after all of the noise he's been making in the run-up to becoming president. Who will be the next casualties of accelerating climate change once the Los Angeles fires finally burn out? Whether or not the long-rumored Chinese and Russian financial and economic collapses will actually occur, and if so, with what consequence? The list is almost endless. Surprisingly, at least to me, the global threat of ideological extremism and terrorism doesn't appear on most such lists. After all, we all know Al-Qaeda has been degraded, Islamic State defeated, the Taliban are focused domestically, trying to manage Afghanistan. Iran, the sponsor of so many groups operating in so many countries, seems to have been wrong-footed by the Israelis. At least they're down, if not out. That caricature would be good news if it were accurate, but is it? My guest today on New Thinking for New World does not think it's accurate. Dr. Rohan Gunaratna is a Singapore academic and a widely recognized expert on global terrorism. Welcome, Dr. Rohan Gunaratna, to New Thinking for a New World.
I'm very honored to speak with you, Alan Stoga. We respect you very much for your own work, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you have.
Well, let's start there. You recently wrote, and I quote, "Global terrorism will remain a persistent and pervasive threat to the stability and peace of the world." So let's start with a horizon scan, looking at the locus and the intensity of the threats from your perspective. And then we'll switch later on to solutions. So there does seem to be a shift in perceived threat in Europe and the United States, wildly more threats in Africa, parts of Asia, and clearly in the Middle East. How do you see things?
The principal threats facing the world, including the United States and Europe, comes from ISIS or the Islamic State. We also are facing threats from Al-Qaeda, but there's a new actor that has emerged. That is the Shia or the Iran-sponsored groups. Primarily, it was from Lebanese Hezbollah, but increasingly we are seeing that Iran's intelligence service, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has planned a number of attacks. They even plan to kill President-elect Trump using a cell in the United States, a man called Farhad Shakiri, who is Afghan-born, living in Iran, recruited American citizens, criminals, to mount that attack. He also planned to hit Israeli consulate in Sri Lanka and kill Israeli tourists in eastern Sri Lanka in a tourist resort. So what we are seeing is, other than the threats posed by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, we are also having the Shia groups sponsored by Iran, and of course Iran's own operators planning and preparing assassinations, sabotage, and other forms of violent activity against states around the world.
So as you look at the world, you don't see a lessening of threat. You see rather a strengthening, more threat.
There is a very significant geopolitical superpower rivalry and competition, but the threat of terrorism has not diminished. In fact, many governments, including the United States government, thought that terrorism will diminish, but we have seen a revitalization of those terrorist networks we thought were defeated, and we have seen a rejuvenation of those groups around the world that are affiliated to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Iran re-emerging.
So let's start with Iran. There is a sense that the Israelis, as I said at the top, have dealt the Iranians some at least tactical blows. The defeat of Hezbollah, the attacks on Iranian military leaders, other efforts in that space, in Lebanon, in Syria, etc. Is Iran down but not out?
Iran is still very capable. Iran is able to mount attacks not only in the Middle East but globally. Iran staged a 7-front war against Israel, Ansarullah in Yemen, the Lebanese Hezbollah that has been crippled by the Israelis, the Shia groups in Syria, in Iraq, and also the Sunni groups in West Bank and Gaza. We have also seen that Iran itself, through its intelligence services, have conducted operations against Israel in Israel and overseas. So the existential threat by the Iranian groups, proxy groups, partners have diminished. But the threat from Iran, because Iran is developing a fully functional nuclear capability, and this poses a threat not only to Israel, but to the United States and to the West. So President-elect Trump stated several times that he is going to work with Israel to curb Iran's surging nuclear program, because none of the Western countries want, or even the Middle Eastern countries want, Iran to have a functional nuclear weapon.
So why do you think Iran, even with the losses it's recently suffered, remains as aggressive as it does? What do the Iranian leadership want?
Iran wants Israel dismantled. Iran wants to be the dominant player in the Middle East. Iran threatens the United States, Europe, and also Iran is capable. Iran is constantly investing in its program. Iran has suffered from the most recent Israeli attack, but Iran, as you said, Alan, is down but not out.
Let's stay in the region and shift to Syria. We've seen the emergence of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the HTS group that has suddenly emerged as the strongman in Syria, defeating Assad. We've seen, much to my surprise, the foreign ministers of Germany and France in Damascus recently, trying to shake hands, but he wouldn't shake hands with the woman who is with Minister Baerbock. A sudden shift in American opinion. We dropped the bounty we had on al-Jawani and our negotiating reduction of sanctions on the Syrians. Clearly, there's been a shift. Clearly, there's been a change. Is HTS, from your point of view, a bit like the Taliban? That is to say, now that they're in power in Syria, they will simply focus on themselves, not be a threat to anyone else, or should we be more worried about this new phenomenon, a renewed phenomenon?
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is an offshoot of ISIS, or Islamic State. Its ideology is compatible with Al-Qaeda. Its model is the Afghan Taliban. It has links with the Taliban, very close relationship with the Taliban. It is a Salafi jihadi group. It advocates Sharia, or Islamic law. It continues to suppress the minorities, the Christians, the Shia, the Alawites, and also the women in Syria. So the Western nations will have to deal with Syria very carefully. Certainly, the West, especially the Americans, have taken a very bold approach of reaching out to HTS. Sometimes you have to shake hands with people who have blood in their hands for greater interests. But I want to also tell you that HTS has made some progress in the recent past, but with its advocation of Sharia, I believe that HTS will not be able to build Syria, because wherever the Islamic laws were applied, none of the countries in the world have progressed. So I think that it is so important for the international security and intelligence community to watch HTS. There are 2 points of caution. One is they have full access to the Mediterranean Sea. In the event of a conflict, the European countries will suffer very significantly from Muslim extremism and terrorism. Second is the countries in the Gulf, especially UAE and Saudi Arabia, will be affected by this group. In fact, a number of important foreign terrorist fighters have been appointed to key positions in the HTS army, in the Syrian army, the new Syrian army. And the Chinese have expressed interest, have expressed concern that Chinese nationals have been appointed, and they come from a group called the Turkestan Islamic Party or the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, and so have other Middle Eastern countries. So I believe that Syria, the new Syria under HTS, is a place we all have to focus on to ensure that they do not emerge as a combined ISIS Al-Qaeda force that has captured power, is a quasi-state, and will threaten the world like ISIS did, or like Taliban did in the past. And Taliban, of course, Afghanistan became a sanctuary. They attacked the United States. So that's why I think that we have to watch Syria with a microscope.
One of the scenarios that some worry about is that Syria becomes the next Libya, in the sense of a collapse of authority, a constant struggle among various groups. In this case, with a lot of outsiders, in this case, Turkey, obviously a very powerful outsider, the Gulf Arabs, very powerful outsiders. Do you worry about this scenario, or do you think there's a chance for Syria to stabilize, albeit under the HTS leadership?
You are very correct, Alan. In fact, we have mapped 2 scenarios. One is Syria can either become a Libya, or Syria can become another Afghanistan. So if it becomes a Libya, that means it descends to chaos. What we are seeing is there will be fragmentation, and there will be so many entities operating in Syria that will fight each other and also attack countries in the neighborhood and also attack the West. So the worst case scenario for Syria is Libya. The most likely scenario for Syria is the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, ruled by Afghan Taliban. And that is why I think that we should do everything we can to work with Syria at this point, although it is ruled by a terrorist entity, a group that engaged in terrorism in the past, a group that engaged in suicide attacks in the past, a group that has lineage both to ISIS and to Al-Qaeda.
Let's stay in the Middle East just for a moment. And I'd like to ask about the role of Turkey. Clearly, the Turks I have some friends who tell me, no, think of it as the new Ottoman Empire, or the renewed Ottoman Empire. The Turks have played a very important role in Syria, in Iraq, and other parts of that region. How do you think about the role of the Turks in this circumstance?
Turkey is the new Iran, according to the security and intelligence estimates by the Israeli community. Turkey is very complex. Erdogan is advocating that Turkey becomes the new Ottoman Empire. Erdogan is also developing various capabilities, long-range capabilities, where they can attack Israel. And I personally believe that it is very important for the West to work with Turkey to ensure that Turkey remains stable and do not go in the direction of targeting Israel. Turkey and Qatar both have invested in HTS, and that is why it is of deep concern for the Israelis. From a Western security perspective, the Europeans want to engage Turkey, and most citizens of Turkey want to work with Europe and with the United States. They do not want to identify so much with the Middle East. And the countries in the Gulf, especially UAE and Saudi Arabia, are very concerned about the direction that Erdogan has taken, because we have seen that the Muslim Brotherhood, we have seen that Hamas and many of these entities have now shifted to Turkey. And no country wants to see a buildup of the Muslim Brotherhood or of Hamas in a country, especially that is working very closely with the West as well as the East.
It is obviously very complex. Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey aspires to be a member of the European Union. I don't think that'll happen in my lifetime. Clearly it has a relationship with the Russians as well as with the Americans. If you were asked, what does Turkey look like 5 years from now? How would you answer that? Is that can you imagine what the Turks are doing 5 years from now?
Turkey will continue to support Syria, and Turkey will exert its influence in the new Middle East. Turkey will continue to expand its influence in Africa and also in certain countries in Asia. Turkey has superpower ambitions. So Turkey will be a very important player. And we all hope that Turkey's rise is peaceful and will not threaten either the neighborhood or the West.
What do War Lessons from Gaza, Rethinking Education, Peace in Ukraine and Visionary Leadership have in common? They are all themes from recent episodes of this podcast. Check out more episodes on tellbergfoundation.org or on a platform of your choice.
You recently pointed out that Africa is emerging as a global epicenter of the terrorist threat. You have all of the countries in West Africa are in trouble, one degree or the other. You have a very strong Russian presence. The French have more or less been thrown out. The Americans are still there, albeit in a much reduced presence. Let's talk a bit about Africa. It's a problem for Africans, for sure. Is it a problem for the rest of the world?
If not for the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, Africa would have certainly emerged as the next epicenter of international terrorism. We have seen that the two most dangerous terrorist groups, ISIS, the Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda, both are operating in Africa. In Africa, the threat has cascaded from the Maghreb or North Africa to the Sahel, and then it's moving further down to the southern parts of Africa, Central Africa and southern parts of Africa, both along the western and the eastern axis of Africa. Again, the threat is moving further south. I myself spend quite a lot of time traveling in Africa, in Libya, in Eastern Africa, and also in Western Africa. So my personal view is that the Western nations should remain engaged in Africa, because like the Middle East, we don't want Africa to become another battleground for terrorism. But what we have seen is that the European countries, especially the French, are withdrawing from Africa, and the Americans are also considering a disengagement from Africa. But if they do that, the African nations that have fought against extremism and terrorism will collapse, and extremist regimes will come to power. There are early signs of it already happening in West Africa. And like the first wave of terrorism came from the Middle East, the second wave of terrorism came from Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the third wave of terrorism will come from the African countries. So if we should think through carefully, we should, at this point, not disengage, but re-engage Africa, strengthen those African countries, build criminal justice and prison systems, build capable military forces that honor human rights, and also economically work with Africa. Otherwise, we will see a new set of actors, China, Russia, Turkey, engaging in Africa, and they themselves will eventually learn that it shouldn't be a rivalry of international powers in Africa, but we all have to work in collaboration if we are to stabilize Africa. So there should be new thinking on the part of leaders, world leaders, how to protect Africa, how to secure Africa, and how to help Africa to build a stable Africa in the future.
I was going to delay going to solutions, but since you're already there, let's talk about that. When you say there needs to be this new thinking among global leaders, you've also suggested earlier and in your writings that Russia's part of the problem. You intimated that China's part of the problem. So when you say that we need new thinking, among whom? Where is this global cooperation going to come from? Do we have? How do we create, as we had briefly in the past after 9/11, a global agreement, a global sense of how to think about this problem positively and together? Doesn't seem like it's possible now.
We have to produce a new generation of leaders. The top universities of the world, especially in the United States and Europe, should have programs to train leaders. Leaders make mistakes, and it cripples the world. President Bush was right in going to Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was a terrorist Disneyland. Al-Qaeda was training 30 different terrorist groups, but he made a fatal mistake by going to Iraq. So my personal view is we have to train leaders better. Leaders should not be confrontational. They should constantly work in cooperation and collaboration. If the Americans can work with the Russians to resolve the Ukrainian conflict, let them do it and let the world support it. If the Americans can work with the Chinese to prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, they should do it. So I think that the approach of the Western leaders also is very problematic. They always want to confront nations, get into conflict with these emerging powers. I believe that the future leaders that we should groom, they should work in cooperation, collaboration, and in partnership to protect international security. Because if we only think of our own interests and we don't think of global interests, we will not have a stable international system. So as we evolve from a unipolar to a multipolar world, what is so important is to protect that international order, to create a stable world. And for this, there should be a different way of thinking rather than conflict, confrontation. We should have leaders and governments and international organizations working to build cooperation, collaboration, and partnership.
Let's take that idea and that concept to your part of the world, to East Asia, Southeast Asia. Clearly, you have a rising China that is the dominant new power. You have the legacy power of the United States. You, as a Singaporean, a very successful but very small country with interests globally. How do you see Asia unfolding?
Henry Kissinger's friend, Lee Kuan Yew, I met him a few times. He understood China. He learned about China from others. He discussed China extensively with Kissinger and other leaders. His policy was, I'm going to work with the West and with the East. I'm going to work with the Americans. I'm going to work with the Chinese. That should be the policy. Because as you explained, we are having one mountain, but two tigers. So I think our strategy should be to work with both China and with the United States to ensure that there is a stable world, that there is a balance, that there is equilibrium. But this idea of a pivot to China has not helped at all. So I think that the strategy should be one of looking at the ancient doctrines, the dharmic doctrines of working together. If we don't change our thinking of containment, confrontation, we are not going to have a stable world. So the ASEAN countries have decided to work both with the United States and both with United States and also China. What they are seeing is that America is still 10 to 20 years ahead of the Chinese. The Chinese are catching up very fast. And if you look at the Nobel Prize winners, 70 to 80% of them are from the United States, from Europe. But the Chinese are also going to get there eventually with their investment in research and technology. So my own thinking is that to have a peaceful rise, to ensure a peaceful rise of China, there needs to be a set of leaders groomed and trained in the Western universities, the top universities like Yale, like Harvard, like Columbia, like Stanford, like Princeton, or like Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. They look at global interests rather than narrow national and regional interests.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's part of the reason why the Telberg Foundation is devoting so much energy to global leadership, why we think that it's terribly important to try to promote a new kind of conversation. But I've got to say that on most days of the week, I find very few people willing to discuss that. There is this notion that we're in a zero-sum world, and so we need to be confrontational to put, as Donald Trump likes to say, America first. I don't actually care who's first. I care who's in the room so that there's a conversation. And I think that, which is part of the reason why we're talking now, but it's also part of the reason why I think some of the issues you mentioned earlier in the terrorist space are growing again because we don't have the kind of robust conversation among those who have a similar worldview. And we're going to have to change that somehow.
The Thalberg Foundation under your leadership, that is Alan Stoga's leadership, can do a lot more. You can build the next generation of leaders who think of leaders like before communism came to this part of the world, before colonialism came to this part of the world. People always thought of the world as the entity, not their narrow national or regional interests. So I also think that ideologically, whether it is Judaism, whether it is Islam, whether it is Buddhism, there are philosophies of working together. Islam has a concept called vasatiya, or moderation. Buddhism has ideology called the middle way, or the middle path, the madhyama pratipatha. Then the Hindus, the Baha'is, the Sikhs, the Manichaeans, the Zoroastrians, they all have such philosophies. So I think that we can draw from history, from the civilizations that ensured humanity's survival for such a long time, and draw from those lessons for the next generation. Because today we are having more conflicts around the world since World War II. My recent conversation with General David Petraeus, he wrote a very interesting book. And in that book, he explained about how there are so many conflicts today than ever before. So I think that there has to be a greater discussion of leaders who can see beyond their term, and leaders who are determined and committed for global peace.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. Thank you very much for this conversation. And I agree with you. We've got to find ways to refocus the discussion that the discussions that are ongoing, to try to encourage a different kind of leadership. We need to get out of this zero-sum world into a positive-sum world. And that requires a different kind of thinking, different kind of leadership. So thank you very much, Dr. Gunaratna, for the work you're doing and for this conversation.
I appreciate your leadership. I appreciate the Thalberg Foundation being a vanguard in global peace. And I want to once again thank you for the excellent work that you have been doing. And I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you again. Thank you for listening to this episode of New Thinking for a New World. I'm Alan Stoga, podcast host, and I look forward to your joining our next conversation. Remember, tell us what you think at thalbergfoundation.org.